Now, there are different expectations from different universities and the dissertation chairs. So as I give information about perhaps as page lengths or some concepts on how to include, whether that be a timeline or whether it be a mind map, again, those are different expectations may be stipulated, but they may not be. For example, I encourage my mentees to put a mind map in Chapter 2, and I'll explain a little bit about that in this lesson and go in more detail of it later. Now, other universities and other faculty or dissertation chairs may not encourage that. They may not even expect that or even want it. Doesn't mean you can't put it in there as a value-added perspective, but they may also tell you not to put it in there. So these different expectations are natural, and they're common in the industry of academia. The point is that we all work collectively together with the universities that we serve to produce your dissertation in a manner that's going to bring great credit upon you and the university that publishes it. I'm going to talk here now a bit about what I call the writing mindset. This is the mindset that you need to have, and these are the characteristics every time you sit down to write, or maybe even before you sit down to write, that these characteristics are important. And if you carry these characteristics with you when you start writing, I believe you're going to produce a better product at the end. So if you got your pen and paper ready, let's go through these, okay? The first one is what I call sifting, that you're going to be sifting through large amounts of content information. Now that may be published articles, it could be books, it could be different research studies. It could be almost any source that provides you information, a secondary source. After all, everything that you're going to be including in Chapter 2, the review of the literature, is coming from a secondary source, something that's already been done, because you're not going to be creating anything new, because the idea is that you're reviewing the available literature. So you have to sift through all the knowledge that's out there. You can certainly use online search engines to help you. I encourage you to use the assistance of a librarian, because if you go through all the wealth of knowledge, let's say perhaps just on teaching K through 12, there's millions of documents that are out there. There's millions of books that are out there. There's different philosophies, depending on what country you're from. There will be different approaches. So what you have to be able to do is go in with the mindset you're much like a miner in the days where they used to take out these little pans, if you will, with screens in them, and they would run it and fill it through the rocks and the water, and all the water would drain out of it, and what would be left would be the rocks. Now, out of all those rocks, if you're mining for gold, you're looking for that one nugget. And in some cases, it's much like looking for a needle in a haystack, that you have to sift through all the rocks to find that gold, or sift through the whole haystack to find that needle. But when you find the right literature that you need for your work, it's very rewarding. You just have to have the mindset that you're going to go through a lot of sources and a lot of references and a lot of information to find the few that you will actually use. The writing mindset of being objective in this sense means that your job is to review the literature. It's not necessarily to assess the literature all the time, because in part of it you're going to review the literature later on in Chapter 2. After you do the review of the literature, then you're going to include more of your critical thinking skills when you start to bring all the content together you use, and you're going to do a comparison and contrast, and then perhaps analyze and evaluate that comparison and contrast and find that new piece of information perhaps that nobody's seen before, because they weren't able to use all the references that you found to be able to get their own ideas. But as you go through writing the information down about all the articles or sources you've read, in most cases what we want you to do right up front is just review the literature. Just state who said what, who had certain agreements, who had certain disagreements, who had refuted something by another researcher, what did one research report suggest. It's not about evaluating it yet, particularly early on in the chapter. Now, there will be information, like I said, where you will do some evaluation, but you want to just be objective. Don't necessarily throw out an article that doesn't agree with your point of view. I understand that you may not like it if it doesn't agree with your point of view, but what we like to have is all the information available to us that shows us the pros and the cons, or the advantages and disadvantages, the agreements or the non-agreements with standard beliefs, ideas, and practices. Another part of the mindset is that you have to be thorough. You have to be thorough in finding the information that's available. And I can tell you that looking online in the online resources available through online libraries or Google Scholar or any other online venture will not serve you as well as going to an actual library. I encourage all my mentees to go to a library, a large university library, perhaps a state university or a large city library, and go there and talk with a librarian and find out what they have that's available for you. Through your universities, if you're in an online program, you have an online library, some sort of collection that's available to you. You probably also have an online librarian available to you. I cannot encourage you enough to contact that person and use those services. You have to do an exhaustive review. This means you should be looking at all the information that's out there regarding your topic that you're going to be writing about. For example, I'll share with you, somebody a couple years ago told me that they had done an exhaustive review on emotional intelligence and that it dated back to 1983. Well, my point of view was that was not very thorough, because while perhaps before the late 1900s nobody talked about emotional intelligence, in the early 1800s emotional intelligence was there. It just was not called emotional intelligence. So an exhaustive literature review would have taken this person back when they started seeing what was available today and where it came from, where it originated from. If they followed the string of authors back farther, then perhaps a guy named Goleman, who wrote his foundational book that's a very popular book today on emotional intelligence. But the idea being that when you're thorough, you go back as far as you can to look at the concepts and ideas. Even the concepts and ideas that we see today in Six Sigma was really born in the agricultural part of the world when we were working in the fields thousands of years ago. They were still concerned then with being efficient, effective, having productivity as high as possible to be able to yield the biggest crop possible. So the idea of being thorough means that you literally have to roll up your sleeves. You have to get in on this, and it takes time. Your writing mindset should be that you're adding value, and this is where you need to think more so of the reader of your work 1, 2, 3, perhaps 5 years from now, is that when you write your information in the chapter, is that when you do that exhaustive, that thorough review after sifting through thousands of documents, that you're writing something that nobody else has done before in a perspective that nobody else has been able to see before. And when you do your analysis work and your evaluation of all the different sources, that you're adding your points of view in a way that nobody else can do. And I don't mean that you're adding your opinions, but when you do a comparison and contrast, you might do a comparison and contrast a little bit different than I would, even if I had the same information that you had to read, because our points of view are different, our philosophies are different, our beliefs are a little bit different. So therefore, as you write this section, chapter 2 of your dissertation, adding value should be something in the back of your mind that says, you know what, I need to not only report what's out there, but I have to add value to it. And I think you know what that means, because I'm sure you've read a book, perhaps you've read an article, perhaps you even looked at a research study, and some of them you read and you said, well, that was nothing, or it really wasn't that exciting, and others added value and made you remember them. And it could be because they gave you a new piece of information. It may be that they gave you a way to understand something completely different. And it doesn't always mean about the content. Even just the mere way in how you write this chapter adds value if it flows well, if the content takes the reader from one place to the next where they understand it and they want to read more because it's interesting and informative. So value adding comes in many different criteria. So how it is for you might be different than how it might be for somebody else. I like to tell my mentees, think of chapter 2 as telling a story. Be a storyteller. Storytelling means that you're able to take all this information and craft a story. Think about writing a manuscript for a movie. Think about writing a manuscript for a book. You have looked at all the information out there, and now you're putting it together. And you're writing a story that only you can put together, because even if I had all that same information again, I could not create the same story that you have. Sometimes I tell my mentees, think about back perhaps when a grandparent told them a story, or their parents. What did they remember from that? What was so important about the story? Were there highlights in there? Were there some sort of action pieces in there? Were there some critical points in there that helped pivot the story? As you look to write your chapter of the review of the literature, think about telling your story about it. Maybe it's writing more at first and then adding in the citations later. Have fun with this. This should be fun because this is one of the times where you actually get to have the academic freedom to do the evaluation, to do the synthesis, to do the comparison and contrasting as it means to you, not necessarily as somebody prescribed for you to do. So think of your work as telling a story and having fun. And when you're done, you'll know whether you told a good story or not. One of the other parts of the writing mindset to keep in mind is that your work should be explanatory. When you look at all the different references that you're going to include, all the sources that you've read, you are in a sense of explaining what they all mean to you. When you do your comparison and contrast, you're basically explaining what one author said as compared to what another author said. You're explaining what and why somebody agrees with one author and perhaps why somebody else does not agree with that person. You're explaining, much like you would explain to a child how to do something, much like you might explain to an employee how to do a certain process. Think about this in the sense that when you're writing your story and you're adding value, that you're explaining something in a manner that provides a rationale, because you're not going to be there for somebody to ask you questions when they read your chapter 2 years from now. It needs to be self-explanatory in the context and in the rationale of what you are writing. And that way it makes it powerful. Now this is also an exploration, so therefore your work, your chapter is exploratory. Think of people who have gone out into the wilderness to find out what's going on. Perhaps a new country was found. In the United States, early on, when nobody had gone west of the Mississippi, they had people who were expeditionary people, and they would have like a gentleman, two gentlemen, Lewis and Clark. They went out into the west. They went out there on their own, and they came back. They were these pioneers, if you will. They were those who went ahead and explored the vast wilderness that nobody had gone to before. Much like Columbus, before they thought that the earth was flat, when Columbus went and realized that the earth was not flat, then he was on this exploration. You're doing the same thing with your review of all the literature. You're on an exploration, so much of your work, when you're writing it, should be with the mindset of that you're reflecting, you're explaining the exploration that you went down. As you start to look at all your references that align with one another and refute from one another, you start to tell that story a bit as you're talking about your exploration in what you're writing. And then the last part in this section of the writing mindset is exhaustive. And exhaustive means just that. It doesn't mean that you've only looked online. It means that you have literally looked everywhere you possibly can. You have gone out to many of your peers and asked for insights and help on finding any literature. You have gone through every opportunity that exists within your online collection, your online library, instead of just only perhaps EBSCO or perhaps ProQuest, that you've looked at all the other sources that are out there that particularly relate to your industry, that you have gone into a physical library and you've talked with a librarian. I used to go every other week to the library at the University of Hawaii when I was working on my dissertation. At that time I lived in Honolulu, and I needed information that was not available online. So I went there every other week for 3 hours for 2 months. After the first time, I realized I should bring some candy and some gifts for the librarian, because the librarians there were very helpful to me. They helped me write a very thorough literature review. They helped me to make sure what I was putting in there was exhaustive, because I exhausted every resource they had in that library. And when I would travel, I would sometimes go to another state library and I would see what they would have. Or when I was at residencies or talking with peers and faculty, I would ask them, do you have any references? Do you know anybody I could talk to? I did my work on the cause and effect of a corporate fitness center. So at that time, I wanted to go and find out about corporate fitness centers. Coors Brewery in Colorado was the best known at the time in the United States. So I made calls to the people. I asked them what literature they use to help support their development of their corporate programs that they had in wellness. Exhaustive means going beyond just a few different references, a few sources. Exhaustive means when you're reading one article and they talk about other authors who have produced information or content that they're citing, that you go back and you find their work and you see if they're referring to somebody else's work. You may have to go back 3 or 4 or 10 different authors, 10 different articles, but this is where you become the expert in your field. Remember, when you are writing your dissertation, you are the expert in what you're writing about. And you can't be an expert if you stay on the surface level. You have to have a certain level of breadth, and you have to have a certain amount of breadth that goes along with that. So breadth and depth go together to make sure that your chapter is this great story from your exploration, and that will add value. In the writing skill set, the areas I want to talk about are similar, if you will, to some other information I've offered in Chapter 1 and will continue to express because the writing skill set is important for a doctoral student, for that academic or researcher to be able to produce a document that's going to get published for the world to see. The first thing I always like to talk about is your writing. Your skill set needs to be specific, that you're to the point, that you take away and you eliminate the empty words and phrases that you might write with otherwise. Being very specific means is when you talk about what author suggested about something, is that you just state it that way. Author A, B, and C indicated that they talked about this and they were in agreement. Author D had a disagreement, and you cite that author, and you're giving the information in a very purposeful manner, and that your work is succinct. When it's specific, it's to the point. You're not taking somebody on a long story. While yes, you are telling a story in this chapter, you don't want to make it a long, drawn-out story. As the saying goes, just the facts, please. Just give us the information. Don't elaborate on it. Don't qualify it. Don't do anything other with it than just provide what you have found. And that makes it very purposeful then. When you write your chapter and it's specific, succinct, and purposeful, there's a flow to your work. There's a flow of movement of content from one section to the next. If you're doing a chapter 2 in a quantitative study, you'll have information related to your dependent variable and then the independent variables. And I'll explain all that in different lessons in this chapter. But for now, the important thing to know is it's purposeful in its design that you have provided your information of the introduction to the chapter. You've given a lot of information about the independent variable. You've given more information about the independent variables, and then you tie it together to show the relationships and interrelationships. That makes your work very specific, succinct, and purposeful. Remember, this is a research study, and as such, you have to write like a researcher, not like a student would perhaps in a class that you're perhaps maybe more used to. The research context means that you use verbiage correctly. If you're talking about the people who you're going to survey, you refer to them as a survey population. If you're going to do a quantitative study, then you talk about a Likert type survey perhaps. Or if you're going to do interviews, and how you're going to do open-ended, semi-structured interviews. As you write this chapter, many of the sources that you're going to use will be from articles or research reports. So when you allude to what one researcher indicated, remember that researcher may not be necessarily an author, and you want to make sure that you're writing to what that researcher wrote about and refer to that person correctly. While the person may have published a journal, that doesn't necessarily make the researcher a writer. A writer, I'm talking about more so like books and popular books that you'll find out there. In writing chapter 2, the whole purpose, if you will, in many ways of the writing skill set is to keep in mind incremental gains, that over time your chapter is going to evolve. And it's going to evolve from the time you start writing about your first article until the absolute last draft goes in for a dissertation approval. Just because you get a proposal approved and you do your research doesn't mean that you won't go back into this chapter in chapter 2 and update it. Remember, from the time you start working on your proposal till the time it's actually published as a dissertation might be 18 to 24, maybe even more months than that. So chapter 2 should be looked at in your mind as perhaps a living document, one that's constantly updated on a regular basis. And incremental gains means that, you write a little bit here, you write a little bit more tomorrow, you proofread it, you make it better. Incremental gains means that constantly you're developing the content and the format to fit the purpose and needs of your university. Incremental gains is exactly the step-by-step process I promote with my mentees, and I have used in my whole career, regardless of what I was doing, to get better over time. Your work, because of these incremental gains, is going to contain these cycles of refinement. It's not uncommon that you'll write several different sections, let's just say perhaps in chapter 2, and you send it to your dissertation chair, and he or she gives you some feedback. You then give it back to them with their revision, and they find new things they want changed. That's okay, that's expected, because sometimes we can't see everything all at the same time. We see what's most glaring as far as the most available opportunities for improvement, and some of them we don't see right away because they're perhaps in the shadow still. But as you bring light on more information, as you revise curriculum, if you will, as you're writing it in chapter 2 to flow a little bit better, sometimes we see some other areas that need to be improved upon. So incremental gains means that it's going to continually get better, and cycles of refinement is just that. Even if you only have 15 minutes, I encourage you to open up your document and proofread it. Make it flow better. Make sure it's more specific and succinct. A lot of students will tell me, I only had 30 minutes to work on it, and so I didn't think that would be enough time. Can you imagine if you had 10 pages you could have went through in 30 minutes and made it better? That means when you have more time later, you're that much more ahead of where you would have been otherwise. Maybe even in the sense of chapter 2, what you're doing with that extra 30 minutes is going into the online collection and finding a new article, finding something that's newer, that's more recent, that's of value to your work, that needs to be included. Because this is a doctoral dissertation, more than ever before, you have to have this formal academic tone. If you're still writing in a casual conversational tone, please do yourself a favor and stop doing that. If you're not sure how to eliminate the slang and the trite sayings from your work, perhaps you might want to look at a dissertation that's been published recently by your university in ProQuest Dissertations and read how others have written their chapter 2s and see the flow of information, see how they presented the findings of different research studies, how they reflected the comparison and contrast in their own evaluations of what other authors have written. This may be just the thing you need to help you develop that formal academic tone. And if you're early in your doctorate program still, and you're perhaps even in the first or second year, and you're still in your content courses, the better you can write in the formal academic tone there, the better you're going to be also. And then, of course, you have to align your work with the prescribed guidance in the APA manual. Unless, of course, you're at a university that has a different manual that prescribes the guidance for the format. Perhaps you're at a university and they use the MLA or the Chicago style or some other style that's suggested or required that you use. Most of the organizations that I have worked with as universities prescribe their work to the APA manual. Those universities I've worked with outside the country still use the APA manual. But it's understandable your university may not. In your case, then just replace APA with whichever you're using and then make sure your work is aligned with that format. And again, if you're not certain exactly what that means, or if your university doesn't prescribe a format, again, the best thing I suggest is go to ProQuest Dissertations online, download a dissertation that's recently been published from your university, and begin to emulate that format that they use there. More than likely, if somebody else's work got approved at your university recently, that if yours is in the same manner, yours will too. Now I want to get into offering some general guidance for chapter design. Not all of these items I'm going to share with you may hold true at your university, so you might want to just check in case they have different guidance than I have and that I'm providing for you. With my mentees, I tell them at a minimum they must write 30 pages of content. This does not include a cover page. It doesn't include an introduction or a conclusion section. It doesn't include a section where they suggest where they found all their information and resources. This is just 30 pages of content. Now, if you're writing a chapter 2 based on a quantitative study, one approach might be that the first 7 to 9 pages is about the dependent variable. Then, if you have 3 independent variables, then you're going to write perhaps 4 to 7 pages on each of those independent variables. Then there'll be a couple pages that shows the relationships and interrelationships. And before you know it, you have 30 pages of content. Now, I know some universities will suggest 20 pages for perhaps a prospectus or a concept paper. That's because they want to make sure what you're doing is offering a decent level of breadth and depth, that you have looked enough to have enough understanding to be able to support your work to create your proposal. But I think if you have at least 30 pages of well-developed content that flows well, it's succinct, specific, and purposeful, you'll be fine. You'll certainly be fine to be able to move through a dissertation chair and get enough feedback where that person can then help you to understand if you need more or not. And this is a minimum with my mentees. I tell them almost all my mentees exceed this. Sometimes they double it. It depends on the topic that you're writing about. Some topics are far more information rich than others. If you're doing something that's new, perhaps cutting edge, you may not even have 30 pages or struggle to get 30 pages. But if nothing else, I find this is a good guidance for people as they're starting out. If you put this in the back of your mind, you got to write 30 pages, then it's easier to meet the expectation if you already have that expectation in mind. Ideally, my guidance to my mentees and others is that in Chapter 2, 85% should be recent and 15% older. And what I mean by this is about when it was published. I consider recent to be within 5 years. So 85% of the references or sources, books, whatever is being used should be within the last 5 years. This is because your work needs to suggest what's going on today or the time when you're writing it, not something that's background information. Now, the idea behind the 15% being older is that you can show where information came from or how a concept or a theory evolved over time, or perhaps give some trending information. That's what that would be used for, not for general citations, not for suggesting what's going on today in today's environment with something that was published 10 years ago. That certainly doesn't make sense, and that's certainly not purposeful in design if you're talking about something current and using a reference that's older than 5 years. In fact, because of the changes in society and the business matters and the economy, we find that even things that were published in 2007, 8, and 9 may no longer even be valid today at the time when I'm talking about this in April of 2014, because much has changed through a recession. And as things do change, it's a dynamic world. Sometimes what's happened and what was practiced even 5 years ago is no longer valid today. So think about your work and try to look at the references. Now, I can tell you, some universities, when they do a review of a dissertation, if they have a stipulation, they actually have somebody counting every reference to find out what the percentage is of all the references that are there. So they'll add them up and they'll say how many are within 5 years, how many are outside of 5 years. And if you're not close to the prescribed guidance of what your university wants, your work will not be approved, and you'll have to go back to the drawing board, if you will, and shore up or improve your work to align with the expectations. The historical and trends information is critical. As I mentioned in the prior item, is that about 15% of the references should be related to the historical backgrounds and trends. Now, when you write about the historical background and trends, think about where did your object or your topic or your content originate from, and then look and bring it from the historical early days to what it is today. If I was going to write something about process improvement or how McDonald's works with their efficiency and effectiveness, I would probably start around the early 1900s in my literature review and suggest how the work of Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management, produced time and motion studies that helped us to understand the efficiency and effectiveness of employees. and as well as processes. Now, it might also bring it to the year 1930s, when other people wrote about how the humanistic point of view should be considered more in the workplace. Then maybe perhaps show some information from Dr. Deming's work, Dr. Duran's work, Dr. Ishikawa's work in Japan in the 1950s. Then I might bring it to the 1970s to the 1990s, where there's information about Six Sigma, total quality management, total quality leadership, and then later into the late 1900s, early 2000s, where Lean Six Sigma was really applied more so than ever before. Here I was showing some historical and trend information. So that's what would be found, if you will, about historical and trends. A lot of times I will have my mentees actually create a timeline. And if the timeline is done well, I'll ask them to include it as a figure in Chapter 2, where they show all the major critical points in the historical timeline on when things changed, where were things that really shifted people's thoughts or approaches. And that also brings more power to your story that telling, because oftentimes having a few figures or tables in there allows for that picture to tell a story. Sometimes they say, is a picture's worth 1,000 words. I agree with that, as long as the picture or the figure and table are produced in a manner that's easy to read and provides value. As you go through writing your Chapter 2, or whenever you collect a reference, even if you're early in the process, you're not even in Chapter 2 yet as far as drafting it, every reference, every source that you look, write on it or make an electronic annotation. Where did you get the source from? Did you find it in ProQuest? Did you find it sitting in the coffee table at Jiffy Lube while you're getting your oil changed? Where did you find it? Because one of the things you're going to have to create in Chapter 2 is a section that tells the reader where you found all your sources. So did you find it in ProQuest Dissertations? Did you find it in EBSCO Did you find it at the local library? You don't have to necessarily say at the local library and in aisle 7 on shelf 3, the 4th book from the end, but you want to be able to say that you went to 2 or 1 libraries and in there you found certain information, because others may want to find some of the same information that you are using, and if they don't know where you found everything, it's going to make it harder for them. Remember, you're not only writing for yourself and your faculty members in your dissertation, but you're writing for a reading audience 1, 2, 3, even more years from now, who when they read your work, they may want to go on their own exploration. They may want to cite some of your work in their work, which would be ideal because that means somebody used your work. And so therefore, let's make it easy for them. So every time you find an article somewhere, if you print it out, just write on there on the top of it in pen, I downloaded it on this date and I found it in EBSCO in the university library. And do that with every source that you do, and you'll find that later when you have to write this section, you'll be able to provide information there. And it may just be that you're going to find one piece of information that somebody else hasn't found before, that one source, that one reference, and somebody's going to say, where'd you get that? And that way you can look at it and say, oh, I found this online in such and such location. Another part of the general guidance for this chapter design is to keep in mind what you're really doing from the very beginning, that with all this information, what you're really going to do with it all is 2 things. You're going to summarize it, and then you're going to synthesize it. You're going to summarize all that you found. Perhaps it's going to be with that historical timeline showing some trends. You're going to show how it's being applied today. What are the concerns? Who agrees with the same information that's out there in the literature? Who argues it? Who offers different perspectives? And as you go through this synthesis, think of it that you're blending all these sources into one. And as the synthesis of all this happens, what you're going to do is provide that higher order critical thinking skill of the evaluation. Perhaps you're going to analyze what this all means and make your own evaluation so that you can show how what's going on today is supported or refuted by the literature. When you identified a problem in Chapter 1 and you decided what you were going to do with your data collection methods, here in this chapter what you're doing is you're providing the background information, the summary, and then synthesizing and evaluating all that something there is conducive to suggest why that problem came to be or why it's still there, or perhaps even why that problem shouldn't even be there today, because there's enough literature out there to support that we should not have the problem. We have enough information in the world that says that hunger should not be anywhere in society in any country, but yet the reality is that in many countries, far too many people don't have enough food and water and die because of it, or get deathly ill in the process and then die. So if we were able to do a literature review, we could show that there's many resources out there. There's enough food to go around. It's just that we don't make it happen. So theory and practice are sometimes two different things. Other parts about the general guidance of this chapter design is, as you look at it, consider that you are doing that exhaustive review of secondary sources. You're not going to take all this information, do any research with it. You're not going to go ask interview questions. You shouldn't even have any personal conversations in this chapter that you allude to. If you did, maybe it's because you talked with an expert. I mean a real subject matter expert. If you're going to talk with a management guru like Warren Bennis, or you were able to talk with Steve Forbes personally and get some insight about what's going on in the financial world, and that related directly to your work, then perhaps you might cite that person because they're an expert. They're a noted world expert. In that case, it's fine. But normally what you're just doing is you're doing the secondary sources, the reviews of that. An article, a book, anything that's already been published is a secondary source. It was produced for some other reason. You're going to use it for your work. To strengthen your chapter 2, to add that real value to it, to make that story really attractive, you should be showing where other authors agree with one another and where there's conflicting perspectives. Not necessarily where you're evaluating it good or bad, but if 3 or 4 authors all agreed on a certain topic and 2 or 3 others had conflicting views, that's what we want to see. That's the comparison and contrast. That's where your synthesis becomes rich, because you've been able to show how a fair amount of people agree with one thing and there's a few others that don't. The power of your literature review is not finding everybody who agrees with one another. It's about finding the value within the content, who's produced what, which are the legitimate people who have been writing and doing research on the same topic that you're working on, that suggests that the problem that you alluded to in chapter 1 is real, that it's been there for a while. An example could be that in the United States, for well over 20 years, the small business failure rate's been at 50% within the first 2 years. There's a lot of information that tells us exactly why that's happened. There's also a lot of information that suggests why that shouldn't be the case. So we could show some historical trending information. We could create a whole story about what's really going on and why the need for more research is required, because the literature review could actually substantiate the need for the problem to have more research conducted. As you work on your chapter 2, think of 2 things as you're putting the content together along with all this other information I gave you, is that you have to show a certain breadth and depth. And that certain breadth and depth comes from the exhaustive review. If you're not doing an exhaustive review, it's hard to get any real breadth and depth. If all you're going to do is write about emotional intelligence and talk about what's happened since 1970, that's not really all that deep. And then you're not going to get so much breadth out of the idea either. You want to talk about leadership theories? Know that there are many leadership theories, and to go deep, you first have to show a breadth. Show the breadth of what's been going on in the leadership body of knowledge, perhaps since the great man theory, and bring it to today's reflections on what's going on with transformational, transactional leadership, and then the other new leadership designs that are coming out there, models, if you will. And then take one of those areas or more and go very deep and show exactly how they came to be. So as you start to look at the breadth and depth, you might want to take a look at the breadth of the problem as it relates to a holistic point of view, but then as you show the depth, perhaps as it relates more to your survey population where you're going to be doing your study, then you're going to go a little deeper there. You're going to go deeper and show more insights about everything that's related to that specific area. Keep in mind the breadth and depth of content, and I believe that you'll do great in creating your story. And the critical points I talked about are the times when things changed. We know that in the United States, after every war, there was a recession. These were critical points because it caused different things to happen in the United States. For example, in World War I, when all the men basically went to the war, the women went to the workplace because the men were gone. Same thing happened in Second World War, is that the women predominantly went to work in the workplace while the men went to war. These were critical points because what happened at these critical points are changes in workplace society, the rules, the way we treat people. And these were all for good things. And the idea being that there are points, what are known as critical points, where the theory fundamentally shifted. If you think of success or progress, it's never a straight line. There's always some bumps in the road, and that bump in the road causes you to go up or causes you to go down. And that's what happens with these critical points. Something new, some new piece of information became available. People started doing things differently for a period of years. After that, there was another change, another critical point, another perspective. That's okay too, and that's what we look at. In most cases, you can consider, as a good example, the different generations that we have of people who are in the workplace. Every time a new generation has come into the workplace, we've had some critical points. We've had critical points in how we manage and how we lead people. We have critical points in how production's occurring. So every time a new generation has moved into the workplace, we've seen some sort of change. Now, it's not necessarily stereotyping that these stereotypes cause the change. It's just a reality that we now have different types of generations, if you will, from whether it be a Generation Y, Generation X, or the baby boomers who are in the workplace. But what's important here to remember is, where are those critical points? In many cases, when you discuss the value of your work, that's what you're going to talk about, is those critical points. Those critical points are the things that are going to make your work insightful. Now, for a few best practices for chapter design. Well, the first best practice I want to talk to you about and share some insights with you is about telling that story. Now, I mentioned it a little bit already, but it's important as a best practice just to keep in mind that you're writing a story. And this story is a story that even Steven Spielberg couldn't write. This story is going to be yours, and it's going to have your name on it. And as you look to create the richness of the story, as you review your own work, make sure that that story is flowing well. I encourage you, when you get done with your literature review, as you're progressing through it, let a couple other people read it. Let them know what you're doing, and then ask them, as they've read it, does it make sense? Does it flow well? Do they get a sense of a beginning and an end? Do they get some sort of historical background or some trending information? Make sure that your story is complete. If it's got a few holes in it, then that's where you know you need to do a little bit more work, find a few more references, and then kind of fill in that hole or make sure the gap is completed. Another best practice is regular visits to the library. And a lot of my mentees do not like this. They think that they can find everything online, that going to a library is a waste of time. Every mentee of mine that have gone to the library have come back and said, wow, I found stuff there I didn't expect, or I met some people there who are helping me. I found some resources I wouldn't have found otherwise. Go to a library. If you need to, or if you can, you know what? Some of the libraries have different types of events there. Take your children with you. Make it a family day. Perhaps maybe your spouse and your children, or your children can go play with other groups of people at the library. Maybe take a tour while you're doing your work. Or make it where you go on a picnic, you go into the library while your family's on the picnic, you do a couple hours in there, then you join them outside, and you have a great day. Kids love libraries. They love to see all the different books, the pages that are out there. They like all the different views that they can find in the different machines. They have computers there that teach them through tutorials. You'll be amazed at what you can learn at a library. If you really want to create a great chapter, find time to go to a library. So now I want to give you a couple quick steps. These steps can help you to create a great chapter. So the first thing is, I say, create a mind map. And if you're not sure what a mind map is, I encourage you to go to Google, to the search engine, and type in there, what is a mind map? Question mark, and then let it search for it. You'll find a lot of information about mind maps. All it is basically, as you're working on your chapter, is you're taking the major points or the theories together. Maybe perhaps it's part of the outline or what will become your outline, and you're showing the connections in a picture form. Maybe you're making circles and you're putting in there your dependent variable, another circle with your independent variable, another circle with one of the other independent variables. If you have 3 independent variables, you'll have 3 circles. And then you'll start to add in more information that you're finding common in the literature. And then you'll start to connect these circles together. And this mind map will give you a visual of all the things that you're going to write about. This mind map is powerful. A lot of people sometimes say early on, well, I don't need a mind map. I'm more logical thinking than I am creative. That's probably the most critical person who needs to do a mind map, because it'll help you see things that you won't see otherwise. Once the creative process gets going, you can also then share this mind map with other people and ask them what's missing or what would you add to it. I do mind mapping on a large window in my living room because I don't have a dry erase board. So what I do is I have dry erase pens, and on a window you can use a dry erase pen, marker if you will, and write on it, and you could leave it there for months, and you can also then go and erase it very easily. I create mind maps on there, and then when I get it done, I'll take a picture with it. I can take a picture with my iPhone, and then I can send it to friends and colleagues and get feedback if I want. Some of the best chapters I've seen have included in chapter 2 a mind map picture, because once you have it there, it's easy to put it into a software program and create a mind map if you should care to. From the mind map, then create an outline. Once you can see the mind map, you can see the major areas, then create an outline with headings and subheadings. If perhaps employee performance is your dependent variable, then under employee performance, what are some of the areas you're going to write about? Perhaps how they were communicated with, what the organizational culture is. These might be subheadings underneath the main heading of employee performance. Create an outline to whatever level of depth you can, but at least include the major headings and the subheadings. Once you get the subheadings done, it'll be easier to drill into it if you have that great mind map that you can pull together. Once you create that outline, then that's all you have to do is take one section at a time from that outline. If you're going to write about that dependent variable of employee performance, you might give a page or 2 of information about that, what employee performance means in the context of which you're writing about. And then if you had those areas about culture and perhaps how they're being communicated to, maybe those are each another page of themselves, then you write that one page at a time, and you build this through that incremental gains where you write one section at a time. You don't have to write all 30 pages at once, you just have to write one section at a time. Much like in chapter 1 when I talked about how to create the nature of the study or the significance of the study section. You only need 4 paragraphs for each one. You can write 4 paragraphs. You can have your dissertation chair review those 4 paragraphs and make them better. Same thing here. Write one section at a time. First, write all the information that you need to do about the dependent variable, and then the first independent variable, and so forth. If you're doing a qualitative study, then you won't have variables to write about, but you'll have more so major themes, some of the other lived experiences that people have seen, whether the stories that have been out there that relate to your case study perhaps, and you will write one section at a time. The best practices for this chapter is no different than the first chapter when I talked about incremental gains. Write one section at a time, let it add up to be huge successes, or in this case, one section becomes added to the next section. Before you know it, you have 30 pages or more, and you have a great chapter. Then, after you're done writing one section at a time on all the content, then you'll then show the relationships and interrelationships. This becomes very easy when you have the mind map, because as you go through and create each section based on how you create your outline, at the end of the chapter is where you start to bring in what are the relationships and interrelationships of all the content that you've written about. How does perhaps the relationship of a supervisor impact employee performance, as well as how does that perhaps impact organizational culture? So there's different relationships there, and if you're writing to that and you're showing through your writing in your story how you explain your exploration about how you did that mind map, this becomes powerful. The idea is that you can write a very powerful chapter 2 with some simple, easy to use understandings that you keep in mind when you're writing, as well as these easy, simple to use steps when you're working on it. Believe me, the mind map and the outline will serve you well. To read it when you're done with your dissertation.